Okay, welcome back to the EoE podcast. Today, we are going to talk about the sometimes dreaded EGD procedure, where you go into the hospital and you have a scope passed down your esophagus, and they do either diagnosis or dilation or all of the above. So we're going to talk about the details of that. A lot of people get scared about that. So after this podcast, hopefully you'll understand it much more and understand the risks and the benefits and everything else that goes along with that, because some people have done it a ton of times, and I'm one of them. So I've been in and out of there doing that for 30 years plus. And so I can tell you all about it. And that's what we're going to do today. So it's just called the EGD, it's upper endoscopy, or EG is esophagogastroduodenoscopy. I'm not saying that right, but I don't even want to try to memorize that rather than EoE. So that's why they call it EGD. So this disease and everything around your esophagus has abbreviations because everything is so long. But so what happens is this EGD procedure, you're going to go in, and this is, well, I'll talk you through exactly what the steps will be, but let's talk about a couple things first. Purposes. So purposes of EGD is, number one, to do a scope so that your GI can take a look at your esophagus, see if they see what's going on, see if they see any evidence of problems or issues or anything else. So that's number one. And number two, to do a biopsy if they need to. If something appears wrong, you have symptoms, they need to do a biopsy, send that off to the lab and see what they see in the biopsy to see if you have eosinophils in this case or anything else that's happening in your esophagus. And number three, to dilate your esophagus if you can't eat or swallow or having trouble in any of those areas. So we're going to talk about all of them. First of all, the scope. So if you're just going in for a scope, it's very simple procedure, non-threatening procedure. The only risks associated with that mainly are really the risks of going under for anything. So the problem with EoE, when you have a biopsy or a scope or anything like that, they have to put you out. They have to put you under. So you go under anesthesia and they put you out. So there's some risk with that. Although people go under every day, all day long in hospitals, and it's very, very small risk. So that's the risk. When they put a scope down your esophagus, it's a small scope. Normally it's going to be fine. All they're going to do is go down and look, take some pictures, potentially take a biopsy or two. If they do a biopsy, it's just a small place where they take a little bit of your skin. You typically won't feel, it's not going to be painful. You may feel it a little bit like just a little place where it feels like a sore or something like that after it's done, but no big deal, the scope part of it. What they do is they go down your esophagus and they go down potentially into your stomach and the top of your small intestine, and that's what an EGD means. It goes down that far, and it covers everything from top to that point, and they try to diagnose what's happening or what they see. If you haven't been diagnosed with EoE, they will do the biopsy, and this is sort of a tricky area here. So depending on your doctor and how familiar they are with EoE, we've talked a little bit about this, but the biopsies are a potential problem because EoE is a patchy disease. It may be prevalent in part of your esophagus and nothing in another part of your esophagus. And if your doctor can't biopsy the right place, it may be misdiagnosed and they think you don't have it when you actually do. So there could be false negatives, not false positive, but false negatives when they don't find any eosinophils in your sample, in your biopsy, but they're actually there in other parts of your esophagus causing problems. Other than that, the procedure is pretty simple. Here's what's going to happen. You go into the hospital, you check in, they put you in a gown, ask you a bunch of questions, put you in a room, and then they put you on a bed and they wheel you into the procedure room, and then they're going to put you under and then put the scope down your esophagus and take a picture. They lay you on your side most of the time. Could be on your back, and you just lay there on the pillow and go to sleep, and next thing you know, you're in the recovery room waking up, and the doctor's going to come in and talk to you about what he or she found. If you're past that point of being diagnosed and you're having trouble swallowing, or even if you haven't been diagnosed yet but you can't swallow, when the doctor goes down there, they're going to take a look and see that, okay, well, I see a stricture here. I know I can see why they can't swallow. In my case, a lot of times they couldn't even get the scope down my esophagus, so they had to stretch me first just to get the scope down and be able to take a look and see what they found. If that's you, then have no fear. There's a fear factor here of dilation in your esophagus. Years ago, they used to say it's a 10% odds of perforating or tearing your esophagus. But nowadays they know that it's 0.1 to 0.4% typically. And the odds go down or low if the GI has done 500 or more stretches, dilations in their experience. If they've done less, then odds go up a little bit. I mean, even with that, the odds of tearing or perforation are still very, very small. You may hear people talk about their experience when they had their esophagus torn, and it's a serious thing. It's very painful. Sometimes they might have to have surgery, and it's not a good thing. So, yes, there is a slight chance that happens, and somebody that's been through it will tell you it's painful, and they never want to do that again. But for the most part, my doctor in Charlotte, North Carolina, was basically an EGD factory. He would just dilate, and it's almost like he could do that as a full-time GI job, and he'd make a ton of money because a lot of people need to be dilated and have their their esophagus checked. And so he just did it like a few days a week. He'd just line them up all day long. So he was a factory. And he was the type that would say, you know what, a lot of doctors are scared of stretching you. And he was kind of a younger doctor, and he'd been through all the numbers and all the stats and all that kind of stuff. And he says people overestimate the odds of tearing your esophagus. So he was very aggressive. So he would stretch and stretch and stretch. And he would go more than any doctor I'd ever been to before. And it's a little more painful the more they stretch you, the recovery is. But still, I never had a tearing problem. And he rarely had any problems with anybody tearing. So a lot depends on your doctor, their experience, how many times they've done this, and how good they are, and how familiar they are with EoE. But so let's talk about stretching, because that's probably the one thing that will give you the most benefit if you have trouble swallowing with EoE. I'll give you my experience. So mine, over time, of course, with EoE, your esophagus gets more and more inflamed and smaller and smaller and smaller. And what would happen with me is my esophagus would get so small, I would eat something that I'm slightly or moderately allergic to, and it would cause my esophagus to close up the rest of the way because it's already small. So even a mild reaction would cause it to close up, and then I got to drink a bunch of Dr. Pepper or liquid to try and keep it open. But as soon as I got stretched, they would stretch me, and typical esophagus is about 25 millimeters around. Somebody with EoE can be down as low as 5, 4, 3, maybe. I was typically around 5, 6, 7, and I would get stretched up to 10, 12, 13, maybe. But once that happened, imagine what that was like. I mean, I'm used to eating at 5 millimeters, and that double that to 10, suddenly I felt like I could eat again. I mean, obviously I'm still the slowest eater in the room, but I could swallow like I hadn't in a long time. So it was a major relief for me every time I had a dilation done. And the procedure goes like this. Same thing as getting a scope. You go under, they do the scope, and then if they're going to dilate you, they use these dilators where there's a few different types. There's one that's called a balloon. It's called a TTS, or through the scope balloon dilators. And what they do is they're really small. They go down your esophagus and they expand it like a balloon. It's kind of like a pop. And they just put it down your esophagus. They blow up the balloon and it stretches. And typically these are best for something if you have a one spot in your esophagus that's small, or you have kind of a ring stricture in your esophagus where it's just a small part that's closed up for some reason. They poke through the middle of that and then balloon pop it out, and then it's stretched. If it's something like mine, the balloon dilators don't work very well because mine is a 14 centimeter stricture that starts at the top of my esophagus and goes halfway down into my esophagus. So the balloon's not going to do anything for something like that. They have to use what are called, they have mercury or tungsten filled bogies is what they call them. The formal name is Maloney or Savory dilators, or Hurst or American. There's a bunch of different types, but they're the same idea. They're basically tapered tubes, and they're small at the tip, and they get bigger as you go, and they got a bunch of different sizes of them. And they'll start small, depending on how your esophagus looks. So they'll put that dilator down and stretch your esophagus, and then they'll go in and take a look and see how it looks and see how much damage was done by the first stretch. And they'll see, okay, is that good enough? Great, we'll stop. Or they'll say, no, we got to do it again. And they'll take a bigger dilator potentially and stretch it some more. And then they'll take a look again. And depending on your doctor, depending on your situation, maybe they go in and stretch a third time. Who knows? But that's the procedure where they run these dilators down your esophagus, stretch it out, and then then they'll typically take a look. I had this GI that was the factory stretcher in my old hospital. He actually told me that, he goes, after I stretch a couple times, I don't look anymore. I don't go down and look. He says, I used to lose sleep because it looks like hamburger after you stretch it a lot. And it looked so bad. I used to have nightmares at night just from the way it looked, because he felt like he was like hurting people because of it just looks terrible. But that's just part of stretching. It tears your esophagus up and it bleeds some and then it has to recover. And that's how it works. But it stretches so that you can swallow and you get that relief. But from other doctors, they go down and look, but and it's not a pretty thing, but it's a necessary thing for a lot of us that have EoE and have trouble swallowing. And from my perspective, it's life-saving. It's relief, and I've probably had it done, and I think we talked about this on previous podcasts, but I've done, 30, 40, 50 times I've been stretched. And I'll usually do it twice every time. So I'll go and get stretched the first time. I'll wait 2 to 3 weeks, which is what they recommend before you go back and do it again. And maybe I go from 5 to 10. And then the second time I go from, if it's not 10 still, it might be down to 9 and go up to 15 or 14 or 13, whatever they can get, whatever the doctor's comfortable with. And so that should last me a little while. Sometimes it lasts me months. Sometimes it lasts me a couple of years. Doesn't last me a couple of years anymore, but it used to. So anyway, so that's what they do, and that's the experience you have. And then what happens is you get done, it's going to be sore, you're going to drink water, you're going to wake up, the doctor's going to come in, and they're going to tell you about what they found. And here's what you want to know. You want to know, okay, what did you see? You want to know where did you biopsy? How many biopsies did you take? And where did you take them? Like top, mid, lower, just one in the middle, or how they did it. And obviously you want the more the merrier, the better accuracy if they take the more biopsies. You're going to want to know how small your esophagus was. And they'll tell you that, well, I fit the 5 millimeter dilator down without much resistance, or 10 millimeter, or I couldn't get the scope down because I had to stretch it first, or whatever the situation is. They'll be able to tell you that, and they'll tell you how much they got you stretched to. So they may say, well, we got you up to 13 millimeters or 10 or something like that. So that gives you a gauge, and if you're going to have multiple stretches in your life, you're going to want to know where you're at and how you're doing. It's hard to tell by swallowing how bad it is, because you get so accustomed to not being able to swallow. It's just hard to tell just by feeling and paying attention to it. But your doctor will know specifically when they go down and try and stretch you. And so you wake up, they'll tell you, okay, here's what you do for recovery. You're going to have some pain. You start with soft foods, maybe some soup, some broth or whatever, applesauce or something like that, just to take it easy for a day or two with soft foods until you're feeling better. And yes, there's pain in your esophagus after you have it stretched, depending on how much they stretched you and which dilators they used and that kind of stuff. And so for the most part, yeah, expect pain. And when you swallow, obviously, you're going to feel that pain, even if you swallow saliva. And you might have chest pain. I mean, I've had it tons of times, and sometimes swallowing causes pain in my chest because you just got stretched. So it's not a simple thing. It's not a pretty thing. So it's a little bit of a recovery. Normally, a couple days, and you're kind of back to eating more normal, and you're up and around. Most of the time, I'm up and around either that night or the next morning, after just sleeping it off. Still eating soft foods for a couple of days potentially, maybe up to 5 days for me, 4 to 5 days maybe of taking it easy on not eating hard food. But for the most part, I think most people are settled in a couple of days, and they're sort of back to almost normal as far as getting around and everything, but just not maybe taking it easy on some of the foods. A lot of people ask, what do I take for the pain? Your doctor will tell you, and it'll be on the paperwork when you leave. It'll say take some Tylenol or whatever they recommend for pain. It won't be anything that thins your blood or anything in case there's any bleeding. And they'll tell you to take it easy on foods, do some liquids for a couple of days or something like that, depending on how you feel. And they might even give you pain medicines not over the counter, but prescription if you think it's bad. A lot of people panic when they have chest pain following it. And they think, I must have torn, it must be serious. But I've never had a good stretch without having some sort of chest pain after. But it always, for me, gets better and goes away. And then here's what happens. So after the pain goes away, you kind of get back to normal. You will notice significantly, for the most part, in my experience, that, wow, it's a lot easier to eat. I don't have to like worry every swallow I take, because I don't have to make sure there's nothing in there but almost liquid to swallow it, because suddenly it's just easier to eat and you don't have to worry about it as much, and you kind of return back to almost normal. And so to me, that's always been my experience with dilations. It's always putting me back to a more normal state. I can eat and without having to pay so much attention to it. I can go out to dinner and have food. I don't eat steak, but I can eat more solid foods, and I still chew them up a lot or whatever, but it's just a better place to be, rather than struggling to keep food or get food to go down, because that's not a pretty place to be. It's not a fun place. That's pretty much the complications that you hear about. They might, depending on the doctor, there could be a perforation or something. And so they will tell you if you have severe pain or anything like that lasts, they're going to tell you to call your doctor, and they might have you come back in. And I've had to go back in one time before and they do a barium swallow where they have you drink this chalky liquid, put you under an x-ray machine and drink it down, and they can watch and see if there's potentially a perforation or something like that. So that's how they identify in a lot of situations if there's something there that happened. But for vast majority of the times, it's just a simple recovery with some pain, and then you're kind of back to normal and back to eating. A couple of keys to wrap up. Number one, when you talk to your doctor, have them describe to you what they're going to do. If they're not clear about what they're going to do when they go down to your esophagus and they just want to go and look first, if it's the first time and you haven't been diagnosed, then that's fine. They need to look around. They need to see what they can find. But if it's something that they've done before and they don't have a plan of action that makes sense for you, then just find out how much they've done this before, or how much experience they have with EoE. Ask some simple questions like, do you have a lot of patients with EoE? How do you do the dilations with them? Just kind of get a feel for how good these doctors are with dilations and EoE, because you want to find the best doctor around you that is used to EoE, that knows about EoE, and especially is experienced with doing dilations, and especially dealing with an EoE esophagus. I've found all the difference in the world comes from doctors' experience and doctors' knowledge, and the more they do, the more they know what to do. So definitely spend your time to find the right doctor that can help you the most, because it's going to pay off in the end big time. Number two, don't be afraid to go in and get stretched and make that appointment. If you have insurance that covers it, or at least close to covers it, even if it doesn't cover it, the relief is so much better to be able to eat, even if you got to pay for it. Like I've done that many times where I just have to pay for my procedure because my insurance doesn't cover whatever, because sometimes I had to be out of network and that kind of thing. But you know what? It's your life. It's eating. It's the ability to be able to function. And so to me, it's always been worth it. So make an appointment, go in and talk about it, and get in there and get stretched and see how much time you can get before you do it again. So here's what it is. The stretch, or EGD, is a stopgap. It's a temporary thing to help you, temporary relief, to give you time to figure out what else to do about your disease. So obviously, we talked about the other solutions. You get stretched, you can eat. Now take a look at medicines to help. Take a look at diet that you can try and change, and figure out that needle in the haystack to figure out what your triggers are. And those two things you should really work on and get familiar with and start experimenting and try to figure out what it is. So what happens if you get stretched, you start doing some elimination diet of some sort, of eliminate dairy or eliminate some of the top food groups that you think you might struggle with and might be your triggers, then watch and see. And in 6 months, if you need to get stretched again, maybe those weren't your triggers. If you can eat better for a longer period of time, then maybe they are. And just work with your doctor to figure out, okay, what are we going to try next, and where are we going from here? The most drastic you'll see is some doctors will say, you know what, it's hard to figure out. We're going to put you on an elemental diet, which is liquid. It's just liquid nutrients only, amino acid type of base of liquids that you drink, and that's it. That's all you do is drink that. And that basically eliminates everything that would be an allergen in your diet and just gets you to the food post-digested, almost like you're drinking nutrients that were already digested from food into your body so you can survive. And I used to think, man, you would lose a lot of weight just drinking liquids. But I saw this story about this kid that had EoE, a bad case of it. And he was a little kid, and he was on this elemental liquid diet for years. And he played on the high school football team, and he was kind of buff. And so, he was doing nothing but the elemental diet and liquids, and he actually was thriving. He was doing great. So they've considered all this and taken into account. The trick is with those is they're expensive, and your insurance might not cover them. So you got to deal with that same old thing of how do we get it paid for? And there may be a trial you can get into to get on those. So just talk to your doctor and see what's available around you to be able to try something like that. So again, that's the most drastic as far as diets go. But then you get into the 6 food elimination diets. You're eliminating the most common food groups that are allergens that people have. And most of the time, you're going to find that one that's similar to everybody else, and it's going to be one of those major food groups. So if you're like me, you have too many to find because you can eliminate all you want, but there's still something else you're eating, and it's another trigger, and it's just really, really hard to figure out. For a lot of people, you eliminate dairy or whatever that one is, and it suddenly works, and you feel better, and things go in the right direction. So people are all over the board. You just never know until you try something and see if it works. And that's pretty much the story about EGDs and dilations. So don't fear, talk to your doctor, cover everything, talk to people that have done it before. I mean, I've been up and down this thing for 30 years, and man, I explained before that when I first started these dilations, they were barbaric, and it was terrible back then. Today's a walk in the park with the doctors and their knowledge, and the technology and everything around that is so much better. And so I have no problem going in and getting scheduled, and I'm actually excited to get dilated most of the time. So don't worry, do your study and read up on it, talk to your doctor, and go have it done and share your experiences with me. I want to hear how you do and hear what kind of relief you have. And then get your time to go and study yourself and figure yourself out and find those triggers. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you next time.